They say a single moment can't define a lifetime, but the old woman I see in the mirror knows that's a gentle lie we tell ourselves. It's a comfort we whisper on quiet nights when the past comes knocking. My moment, the one that chiseled these lines onto my face and placed a permanent weight behind my eyes, didn't happen in a sunlit room or a lover's embrace. It came in a fury of wind and water, a choice born in the heart of a tempest. A choice that cost me the only career I ever wanted, but gave me, well, it gave me the story and the quiet understanding that has taken me 50 years to fully grasp. I live in a small cottage now, perched on the edge of the Cornish coast. The sea is my closest neighbor. Most days, it's a placid friend, a shimmering sheet of silver and blue that whispers gentle secrets to the shore. But sometimes, when the sky turns a bruised purple and the gulls fly inland, I hear a different sound. I hear the roar of the past, the shriek of the wind, and I am no longer Eleanor Vance, the quiet woman who tends her roses. I am Lieutenant Vance of the Royal Navy, 24 years old, and I am standing on the bridge of the HMS Sentinel as the world comes apart around me. It was the autumn of 1978. The air had been heavy for days, thick with an unspoken promise of violence. We were on a routine patrol in the English Channel, a monotonous but essential duty, a floating piece of sovereign territory keeping watch over the arteries of trade. I loved the Navy. I loved it with the fierce, uncomplicated passion of the young. It was more than a job, it was an identity. It was the crisp uniform, the salty air that seemed to scrub your soul clean, the unshakable camaraderie. Most of all, it was the order of it all. Every action had a protocol, every problem had a procedure. It was a world built of straight lines and clear commands, a fortress against the chaos of civilian life. I thrived in that fortress. I was good at my job, ambitious, with my eyes set on a long and distinguished career. I saw my future mapped out as clearly as a nautical chart, a steady ascent through the ranks. The ship, the HMS Sentinel, was a frigate. Not a giant, but a powerful, gray workhorse, filled with the hum of machinery and the quiet confidence of a well-trained crew. My commanding officer was Commander Davies, a decent man whose ambition was tempered by a deep-seated caution. He was a company man, through and through. His guiding star was the rulebook, his holy text was the chain of command. And at the very top of that chain, a near-mythical figure to a junior officer like me, was Fleet Admiral Sterling. He was a legend, a man carved from the same granite as the cliffs of Dover. His name was synonymous with discipline, with an unwavering, almost brutal adherence to protocol. We were told stories of his time in service, of his cold, calculated decisions that had saved missions and ships, sometimes at a terrible cost. He was the architect of the modern naval code we lived by. To defy an order from Admiral Sterling was unthinkable. It wasn't just insubordination, it was a form of sacrilege. The first sign of trouble was a change in the water's texture. It lost its gentle rhythm and began to move with a sullen, agitated chop. The meteorological reports that came chattering through the telex machine grew more and more severe. A low-pressure system, once a distant smudge on the weather charts, was deepening with alarming speed, transforming into a full-blown tempest that the forecasters were calling a once-in-a-generation storm. Commander Davies was prudent. He ordered all non-essential personnel below deck and had the ship secured for heavy weather. We were a naval frigate, designed to withstand the ocean's fury. We would ride it out, stick to our patrol grid, and continue our mission. That was the plan. That was the protocol. Then came the voice. It was faint at first, a ghost in the static of the radio, a desperate thread of sound amidst the rising howl of the wind. A civilian Mayday call. Channel 16 crackled to life, and a man's voice, tight with panic, cut through the ether. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Sailing Vessel Wanderer. We are taking on water. Engine has failed. Our mast is gone. I repeat, our mast is gone. We are at the mercy of the sea. He gave his coordinates. My stomach tightened as I plotted them on the chart. They were just outside our designated patrol sector. Not far, perhaps 20 nautical miles, but in the rigid world of naval operations, it might as well have been on the other side of the planet. Commander Davies's face was a mask of grim professionalism. He did exactly what he was supposed to do. He relayed the distress call and the Wanderer's position to Fleet Command. We all stood on the bridge in a tense silence, the ship groaning around us as the waves began to slam against the hull with the force of sledgehammers. The wind screamed. Through the thick, salt-streaked glass of the bridge, the world had become a churning chaos of gray and white. We waited. For a junior officer, waiting for a command is a unique form of torment. You are poised to act, your entire being straining for purpose, yet you are powerless. Then another voice came over the radio, a woman's this time, her terror a sharp counterpoint to the man's strained control. "Please," she sobbed, "is anyone there? We have a child on board. My daughter, she's so cold." And then, beneath her plea, I heard it. A sound that had no place in our world of steel and orders. The thin, terrified wail of a little girl. That sound, it bypassed the protocol. It bypassed the training. It went straight into my soul and twisted. It was the sound of pure, helpless fear. It was the most human sound I had ever heard. The reply from Fleet Command came through moments later, encrypted and direct. Commander Davies read it from the printout, his own voice devoid of emotion, but I saw the muscles in his jaw clench. The order was from Admiral Sterling himself. HMS Sentinel to maintain current position and mission objectives. Acknowledge. There was a second part, a justification. Civilian vessel disregarded maritime storm warnings. Risk to naval asset and crew of 180 souls deemed unacceptable for recovery of 3. No further action. That was it. It was a death sentence, delivered by telex. The protocol was absolute. The cold, hard logic was unassailable. Risking a multi-million-pound warship and its crew for a small family who had made a foolish mistake was, in the grand calculus of naval strategy, an unacceptable gamble. Commander Davies looked at me, his eyes holding a flicker of something, regret, perhaps. But it was fleeting. "You heard the order, Lieutenant," he said, his voice clipped. "Acknowledge the command." I stood there frozen. My hand hovered over the console. Outside, the storm raged. On the radio, there was only static now. The Wanderer had gone silent. But I could still hear the child crying. I could hear it as clearly as if she were standing next to me. The fortress of rules and regulations I had built my life inside suddenly felt like a prison. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that I was about to tear it all down. The silence on the bridge was heavier than the storm. Every man was looking at me, waiting for me to send the acknowledgement. To type out the sterile words that would seal the fate of 3 people I had never met. Commander Davies stared at me, his expression hardening. He was a man who had built his career on following orders, and he saw in my hesitation the one thing he could not tolerate, a crack in the chain of command. "Lieutenant Vance," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "do not make me repeat myself." But I wasn't listening to him anymore. I was listening to the ghost of a child's cry. I was thinking of the father, the mother, adrift in that roaring darkness, their final moments filled with the terror of a cold, indifferent sea. The Admiral's logic was perfect. It was also monstrous. My mind raced, scrambling for a way out, for a path that wasn't a choice between my career and my conscience. The rulebook was thick, filled with thousands of regulations. There had to be something, a loophole, a forgotten subclause that could justify the humane choice. But there wasn't. The order was direct, unambiguous, and came from the highest authority. To disobey it was career suicide. A court-martial was a certainty. Dishonorable discharge. The end of everything I had worked for. I looked at the navigational display. The blinking green dot of the HMS Sentinel, steadfast in its designated box. And 20 miles away, a red cross I had marked myself, the last known position of the Wanderer. 20 miles of raging hell. My training screamed at me, obey. My ambition screamed at me, obey. My entire future depended on a single word, acknowledged. But my heart, a part of me I had long suppressed in the name of duty, screamed louder. It screamed, do something. And so I did. I took a deep breath, the cold, recycled air of the bridge feeling thin in my lungs. I turned to the junior communications officer, a young lad named Peters who was barely out of his teens. "Petty Officer Peters," I said, my voice shaking only slightly, "I am experiencing a critical malfunction in the primary navigation system. It appears we have a catastrophic gyroscope failure. It's throwing our positional data into chaos." The lie came out more smoothly than I expected. It tasted like ash in my mouth, but it was there. Peter's eyes went wide. He looked at his own console, which, of course, showed everything was perfectly fine. Commander Davies took 2 steps toward me, his face turning a shade of purple I'd never seen before. "What in God's name are you talking about, Vance?" "The systems are green across the board." "Negative, Commander," I said, forcing a cold certainty into my tone. I pointed to a secondary screen, one I knew had a history of intermittent glitches. "The repeater is failing to slave to the master gyro. I can't trust our position. According to this, we are drifting dangerously off course toward the shallow waters. I need to take manual control and establish a new navigational fix. My duty of care for this vessel's safety is paramount." I was quoting from another part of the rulebook, the section on a junior officer's emergency authority when the ship itself is in immediate peril. It was a flimsy, desperate gambit. Davies stared at me, his mouth opening and closing. He wasn't a stupid man. He knew exactly what I was doing. He saw the lie clear as day. But it was a clever lie. It was a lie that, if he chose to believe it, would give him plausible deniability. I was claiming the ship was in danger. I was invoking my direct responsibility to prevent its loss. It was my word against the instruments, and I was the officer on watch. For a moment, our eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. He could have me arrested on the spot. He could have me confined to my quarters and take the con himself. But that would mean officially noting in the log that he, the commander, ignored a reported critical safety failure from his officer of the watch. And if something, anything, were to actually go wrong with the ship later, the blame would fall squarely on him. I had put him in an impossible position. He looked away first. He walked to the other side of the bridge and stared out into the maelstrom, his back to me. "Very well, Lieutenant," he said, his voice a low growl that was barely audible over the storm. "Fix your navigational problem. But you will log every single maneuver. Every single one." It wasn't permission. It was the furthest thing from it. But it wasn't a no. And that was all I needed. I took the con. "Helm," I ordered, my voice ringing with a newfound authority, "come right to new course 075. The helmsman, a stoic chief petty officer with 20 years of service, glanced at the commander, then back at me. He saw the truth in my eyes, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of respect. He didn't question the order. He just repeated it. "Coming right, new course 075 I." The great ship shuddered as it began its turn, fighting the monstrous waves, turning its nose away from the safety of its designated patrol route and toward the heart of the storm. Toward the Red Cross on my map. Toward the family on the Wanderer. Every man on that bridge knew what was happening. I had seized control of a Royal Navy frigate in defiance of a direct order. The lie about the gyroscope was a transparent shield, but it was a shield they all tacitly stood behind. They were now all complicit in my mutiny. The next hour was a descent into chaos. The Sentinel was a fine ship, but she was being treated like a toy by the sea. Green water, tons of it, crashed over the bow and swept across the decks. The ship pitched and rolled with a violence that threw men against bulkheads. Down below, alarms were ringing as systems struggled to cope with the strain. On the bridge, we were strapped into our seats, our world a dizzying lurch of up and down, side to side. The noise was constant, a deafening symphony of groaning metal, shrieking wind, and the percussive boom of waves against the hull. Through it all, I kept my eyes on the radar, searching for a tiny blip in the sea clutter. "Searchlight crews, stand by." I yelled into the comms. "I want eyes on the water. Look for anything. A hole, debris, a flash of color." The response was immediate. My crew, my wonderful, brave crew, didn't hesitate. They knew the risk I was taking, the risk we were all now taking. But they also knew there was a family out there. And in that moment, the unwritten rule of the sea, the duty to save a life in peril, eclipsed every other protocol in the book. Contact. Bearing 079er. The shout came from the radar operator. A faint, intermittent return. It could have been a rogue wave, a ghost in the machine. Hold that contact. I yelled. Helm, bring us onto that bearing. Slow to 5 knots. The ship groaned in protest as its engines fought to slow its momentum in the churning sea. It was like trying to park a bus in an avalanche. The searchlights cut through the driving rain and spray, their powerful beams sweeping across a landscape of liquid mountains. For minutes that felt like years, there was nothing. Just the horrifying, empty expanse of the angry ocean. My hope began to curdle into dread. Had we been too late? Then, a shout from the lookout on the port bridge wing. Object in the water. 10 degrees off the port bow. I strained my eyes, peering through the spinning wipers. And I saw it. A dark shape, almost completely submerged, rising on the crest of a wave before plunging back into a trough. It was the Wanderer's hull, upside down. My heart sank. We were too late. They were gone. But then the lookout screamed again. Survivors. I see them. They're clinging to the keel. A surge of adrenaline, fierce and hot, shot through me. They're alive. I roared. All hands, rescue stations. Portside seaboat, stand by for launch. Commander Davies, who had been a statue of grim silence, finally moved. He strode to my side. Are you insane, Vance? He hissed. You'll never launch a seaboat in this. It's a suicide mission. He was right. The sea was far too rough. The small inflatable boat would be swamped in seconds. You're right, Commander, I said, my mind already working on another, even more dangerous plan. We'll bring the ship to them. What followed was the most difficult piece of seamanship of my life. I had to maneuver a 4,000-ton frigate, a vessel designed for combat on the open ocean, alongside the tiny, overturned hull of a sailboat without crushing it or the people clinging to it. All while the sea was doing its best to tear us to pieces. I used the bow thrusters, the twin screws, every ounce of my training and instinct. I ignored the screaming proximity alarms. Inch by agonizing inch, we closed the gap. The ship was a bucking bronco, and the keel of the Wanderer appeared and disappeared in the troughs, but we got closer. We got a line to them. Then another. A team of my bravest sailors, tethered by safety harnesses, were on the deck, waiting. The man, who I now saw had a bloody gash on his forehead, was holding onto the keel with one hand and a small, bundled shape with the other. The woman was next to him, her face a pale blur of exhaustion. He helped her first, and my crew hauled her over the railing. Then, with a strength I couldn't comprehend, he held up the bundle. My daughter, he screamed over the wind. Take my daughter. A chief petty officer, a man with kids of his own, leaned precariously over the side as the ship rolled, and with perfect timing, he snatched the child from the father's grasp. He held her like she was made of glass and passed her back to the medics. Finally, it was the man's turn. He was at the end of his strength. As my crew pulled him from the water, he collapsed onto the deck, a shivering, gasping heap. The rescue was over. It had taken 27 minutes from the moment we spotted them. 27 minutes of the most intense, terrifying, and ultimately triumphant moments of my life. The family, the father, Arthur, his wife, Clara, and their little girl, Lily, were alive. They were whisked below deck to the sickbay, wrapped in blankets and tended to by the ship's doctor. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for the better part of an hour. My hands were shaking. My uniform was soaked with sweat and spray. The bridge was quiet again, save for the hum of the ship's systems and the now familiar roar of the storm outside. I had done it. I had broken every rule, but I had saved them. I looked over at Commander Davies. He was staring at me, and his face was unreadable. It wasn't anger, not anymore. It was something else, something much more complicated. He just shook his head slowly and walked back to his station without a word. The silence was my answer. I had won the battle with the sea, but the war for my career, I knew, had just begun, and I was about to face a far more formidable foe than the storm. The journey back to Portsmouth was the longest of my life. The storm eventually blew itself out, leaving behind a bruised, sullen sky and a sea that still heaved with exhaustion. The atmosphere on the ship had changed. The crew treated me with a new kind of respect, a quiet deference that was mixed with pity. They knew what was coming for me. I was the officer who had saved 3 lives, but I was also the officer who had committed a cardinal sin. I spent hours writing the official log, my pen hovering over the page. I stuck to the lie. The navigational malfunction. The emergency course correction. It felt flimsy and false, a child's excuse for a monumental act of defiance. Every word I wrote was a nail in the coffin of my own career, but it was the only shield I could offer my crew and Commander Davies, who had let me do it. When we docked at HMB Portsmouth, the reception was cold and formal. There were no congratulations, no handshakes. Just a summons. Lieutenant Vance, the Admiral wants to see you. Now, my blood ran cold. Not just any Admiral. Admiral Sterling. He hadn't delegated this. He had come himself. It was a sign of just how serious this was. I was escorted by 2 stone-faced naval policemen to a sterile, intimidating office in the main command building. An office that felt like it was refrigerated. And there he was. Admiral Sterling was smaller in person than I had imagined from the legends, but his presence filled the room, sucking all the air out of it. He was a man in his late 60s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered oak and eyes the color of a winter sea. He didn't rise when I entered. He just pointed to a single, hard-backed chair in front of his massive desk. "Lieutenant," he said, and his voice was exactly as I'd imagined, quiet, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. I sat. My back was ramrod straight. My uniform, which I had taken pains to press, suddenly felt like a costume. He had my report, the ship's log, and a dozen other files spread out before him. He didn't look at them. He just looked at me. He let the silence stretch, a tactic I knew was designed to unnerve me. I met his gaze. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing my fear. "You reported a catastrophic gyroscope failure, Lieutenant," he began, his voice dangerously soft. "A most unfortunate and remarkably convenient malfunction. The finest naval engineers in the fleet have been over your ship's systems for the past 3 hours. They have stripped down the primary navigation suite, run every diagnostic known to man. Can you guess what they found?" He paused. "Absolutely nothing. The system is, and was, functioning perfectly." My mouth was dry. "With all due respect, Admiral." "Do not," he cut me off, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly, "insult my intelligence by continuing this fiction. I know what you did. You knew what you were doing. You deliberately and willfully disobeyed a direct order from Fleet Command, issued by me. You commandeered a 180-man frigate, risked a valuable naval asset, and endangered the lives of your entire crew to conduct an unauthorized civilian rescue outside of your operational jurisdiction. These are the facts. Are they not?" "Yes, sir," I whispered. The lie was pointless now. "They are." He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. "Tell me why." It wasn't a question born of curiosity. It was an interrogation. I want to understand the thought process of a young, promising officer who decides to throw her entire future away. Was it for glory? A misplaced sense of heroism? "No, sir," I said, finding my voice. "It was for the child." His eyes flickered, just for a second. "I heard a child crying on the radio, sir. The protocol said to let them die. My conscience said otherwise." "Your conscience," he repeated the word as if it were a foreign object he was examining for flaws. "The Royal Navy is not an organization that runs on the individual consciences of junior officers, Lieutenant Vance. It runs on discipline. It runs on orders. It runs on the cold, hard calculus of risk and asset management. That is how we win wars. That is how we protect this nation. The moment we allow personal feelings to override strategic directives is the moment we cease to be an effective fighting force. You made a choice. You chose 3 strangers over your duty to this service. You chose emotion over logic." He stood up and walked to the window, which overlooked the bustling naval yard. "There will be no court-martial," he said, his back to me. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost made me dizzy, washed over me. It was followed immediately by dread. This wasn't mercy. A court-martial would be a public spectacle, he continued. It would force a debate about the very nature of our protocols. It would be messy. Your commander has submitted a report that supports your fabricated story of equipment failure, a lapse in judgment on his part for which he will be paying for the rest of his career, I assure you. Your record, until now, has been exemplary. Therefore, for the good of the service, this entire incident will be buried. You will tender your resignation, effective immediately, for personal reasons. It will be accepted. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement so binding that if you ever speak a word of this to anyone, the consequences will be severe. Your naval career is over, Lieutenant. You will be erased. Is that clear? Yes, Admiral, I said. My voice was a hollow echo in the silent room. Erased. That was the word he used. And that's what it felt like. I had walked into that office as a proud officer of the Royal Navy. I walked out as a civilian, a nobody. My identity, my future, my entire world had been stripped away in a 10-minute conversation. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and quiet goodbyes. My crew avoided my eyes. They felt guilty, I think, that I was taking the fall alone. I packed my few belongings from my quarters. Before I walked out of the naval base gates for the last time, a package was delivered to me by a mail orderly. It was a simple manila envelope with no return address. Inside, there was a letter written on cheap stationery in a shaky but neat hand. It read, "Dear Lieutenant Vance, my name is Arthur Finch. You pulled me, my wife Clara, and my daughter Lily from the sea 2 days ago. There are no words in the English language to express the depth of our gratitude. We were told that we were not to contact you, that the circumstances of our rescue were complicated. But I could not leave without you knowing. You did not just save our lives. You gave my daughter back her future. You gave my wife back her husband. I will never forget the look on your face on the bridge of your ship. It was the face of kindness in the middle of hell. We owe you everything. We will live our lives in a way that honors the sacrifice you made. I know you made a sacrifice. I don't know what it was, but I saw it in your eyes. Thank you." Tucked inside the letter was another piece of paper. It was a child's drawing, done in crayon. A big, lopsided gray ship with smoke coming out of the funnel, and next to it, a tiny little boat with 3 stick figures waving. At the top, in wobbly letters, was the name Lily. I clutched that drawing in my hand as I walked out into the civilian world. My career was gone. My name was erased from the records. I had lost everything I thought I ever wanted. All I had to show for it was a thank you note from a stranger and a child's drawing. For many years, I thought it was a terribly unfair trade. Life went on, as it has a stubborn way of doing. I moved away from Portsmouth, needing to put as much distance as possible between my new life and the ghost of my old one. I took a series of unremarkable jobs. I worked in administration, in a library, in a local council office. I never married. Perhaps the Navy had instilled in me a self-sufficiency that didn't lean easily on others, or maybe the part of me that knew how to love with that kind of fierce devotion had been given to the sea, and I never quite got it back. I settled here, in this small cottage in Cornwall, where I could see the ocean but not be owned by it. The years softened the sharp edges of the memory, but they never erased it. The past became a story I told only to myself, a secret locked away with a faded letter and a child's drawing. Arthur, Clara, Lily. I often wondered what became of them, if they were happy, if Lily grew up to be strong and kind. I hoped they had honored their promise to live lives worthy of the sacrifice. My sacrifice. Then, about 15 years ago, on a quiet Tuesday morning, the past reached out and found me. I was reading the newspaper, a national broadsheet, while having my tea. And there it was. A full-page obituary. Admiral of the Fleet Lord Stirling, hero of the Navy, dies at 88. It was a long article detailing his storied career, his unwavering dedication, his shaping of the modern Navy. It spoke of his discipline, his strategic genius. It painted a portrait of the man I remembered, the man who had broken me. And then I read the final paragraphs, the part about his personal life. The article mentioned his late wife and his one child, a son. My eyes scanned the words and then stopped. My teacup rattled in its saucer. The Admiral's life was also marked by personal tragedy, the obituary read. His only son, Arthur Sterling Finch, a promising academic who chose a different path from his father, was estranged from the family for many years. Arthur, along with his wife, Clara, and their young daughter, Lily, were tragically lost at sea during a severe storm in the English Channel in the autumn of 1978. Their bodies were never recovered. I read the sentence again and again. Lost at sea. 1978. Arthur. Clara. Lily. The newspaper slipped from my fingers. A cold shock, colder than any wave that had ever crashed over the deck of the Sentinel, washed through me. Arthur Finch. Arthur Sterling Finch. The man I had pulled from the water, the man whose grateful letter I had treasured for decades, was the estranged son of the very man who had ended my career for saving him. Suddenly, the last 50 years of my life rearranged themselves in my mind. The entire story was reframed in a blinding flash of understanding. Admiral Sterling, the man of iron protocol, the man who had sent the order, "Do not engage." He had, by the book, sentenced his own son, his own daughter-in-law, his own granddaughter to death. And I, a lowly lieutenant, had defied him. I had saved them. I thought back to that cold, sterile office. The Admiral's controlled fury. His strange decision to avoid a court-martial. It would be messy, he'd said. It would have been more than messy. It would have been impossible. A public trial would have revealed that his own protocol, the bedrock of his entire legacy, would have killed his family. He would have been forced to admit that his rigid adherence to the rules was a fatal flaw. And worse, he would have had to publicly acknowledge that a junior officer's emotional, insubordinate conscience had succeeded where his logic had failed. He couldn't do it. His pride, his entire identity, was too deeply intertwined with the infallibility of the rules he had created. And so, he chose another way. He buried it. He erased me to protect himself, but in doing so, he also protected his son. By discharging me quietly, by forcing my silence, he allowed Arthur, Clara, and Lily to disappear. He let the world believe they were dead. He let them start a new life, free from the shadow of the Sterling name, a name Arthur had clearly rejected. My punishment wasn't a punishment at all. It was a transaction. It was the Admiral's silent, conflicted, agonizing way of thanking me. He took my career, and in exchange, I gave him back his son's life, preserved in secret. He sacrificed me to save his own legacy, but he also sacrificed his relationship with his son forever to grant him the one thing he seemed to want: anonymity. I walked over to the old wooden chest where I keep my most precious things. I took out the manila envelope. My hands were trembling as I unfolded the letter from Arthur and the drawing from Lily. The crayon colors were faded now, the paper yellowed and soft with age. This wasn't just a memento of a rescue. This was the secret history of a great man's hidden heart. It was proof of a family saved not by the rules, but in spite of them. I look out at the sea now, and I no longer see it as the thing that cost me my future. I see it as the place where my true life was forged. I didn't get the career I dreamed of. I have no medals, no pension, no grand portrait hanging in a naval hall. My name is not in any official record of valor. According to history, I am no one. But I know the truth. In that storm, I did more than save a family. I stepped into the heart of a father's silent grief, a son's desperate bid for freedom. I became the unlikely keeper of a secret that allowed a little girl named Lily to grow up, to have a future, to draw pictures. They say a single moment can't define a lifetime. But my moment in the storm did. It didn't define me by the rank I lost, but by the choice I made. I chose compassion over protocol. I chose a child's cry over a command. It was a trade, a career for a conscience. And as I stand here now, an old woman in a quiet cottage by the sea, holding a faded drawing of a big gray ship, I know, with a piece that has taken 50 years to settle in my soul, that it was the best trade I ever made. I was erased, just as the Admiral promised. But the lives he allowed me to save, his own bloodline, were my real legacy. And that is a story no one can ever take away from me. There's an old ship's compass on my mantelpiece, its brass casing greened with age, its glass clouded by 1,000 phantom storms. It doesn't work anymore. The needle, once so faithful to the pole of the north, now just quivers aimlessly, a prisoner of its own small world. My grandchildren think it's just a curious antique, a piece of nautical junk I picked up at a seaside market. But I know better. That compass is the truest thing I own. It doesn't point north. It points to a single night in the autumn of 1983, to a choice that rerouted my entire life. It points to the moment I learned that the most important orders are not the ones that are spoken, but the ones that are whispered by the soul when the world is screaming at you to do otherwise. My name is Sarah Jenkins, and for a short, brilliant time, I was a lieutenant in the United States Navy. This compass is all I have left to prove it. I live in a small, cedar-shingled house overlooking the Strait of Juan de Fuca now. The water here can be moody, shifting from a placid mirror to a field of whitecaps in the time it takes to make a pot of coffee. It's a constant reminder. In 1983, I was 25 years old, and my world was the steel-gray deck of the USS Monterey, a guided missile destroyer. I was the communications officer. My domain was a small, windowless room filled with the hum of electronics and the constant, rhythmic chatter of coded messages. I loved it. I loved the certainty of it. The Navy wasn't just a career, it was a calling. It was a place where life made sense, where every problem had a procedure and every person had a purpose. It was a fortress of order built against the messy, unpredictable tide of human nature. Our captain was a man named Marcus Thorne. Captain Thorne was a good officer, sharp and ambitious, with a political astuteness that many of his peers lacked. He understood that a career in the peacetime Navy was built as much on avoiding mistakes as it was on acts of valor. He navigated the treacherous waters of command with a cautious hand, his eyes always on the next promotion, the next star on his collar. The backdrop to all of this was the Cold War, a silent, global chess match played with submarines and satellites. We were a piece on that board, a projection of American power, and the rules of the game were absolute. Protocol wasn't just a guideline, it was scripture. And the penalty for heresy was severe. We were on patrol off the coast of Washington, charting the cold, deep waters that led out into the vastness of the Pacific. The sky had been a heavy, bruised color for days, and the sea beneath it was restless. The weather reports had been growing steadily more ominous. A storm, born in the Gulf of Alaska, was spiraling down the coast, gathering a terrible, furious energy. We were ordered to hold our position, to secure for sea and ride it out. The Monterey was built for this. A 400-foot ship of the line, she was designed to face down the enemy, whether it was a Soviet warship or the wrath of the ocean itself. We were safe. We were on mission. We were following the rules. The call came just after midnight. It was a faint, desperate signal on the civilian emergency band, a voice shredded by static and terror. Mayday. Mayday. This is the pleasure craft Sea Serpent, taking on water fast. Our engine is gone. The voice was a man's, stretched thin with panic. We are caught. God, we are caught in it. My family is on board. He tried to give his coordinates, but the signal was breaking up, distorted by the atmospheric chaos of the storm. I worked frantically, triangulating the fragmented transmissions, my fingers flying across the console. Finally, I got a lock. A single, blinking red dot on my screen. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. They were in a notoriously treacherous stretch of water, an area sailors called the Graveyard of the Pacific, a place where unpredictable currents and violent weather had claimed hundreds of ships over the centuries. Captain Thorne stood beside me, his face illuminated by the green glow of the radar screen. The ship pitched violently, and we both braced ourselves against the console. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee. "Get me Packful Command," he ordered, his voice tight. "Relay the distress call and their position. Request instructions." I did as I was told, my fingers tapping out the coded message. It was standard procedure. We were a military vessel on a classified patrol. We couldn't just break formation and go chasing after a civilian boat without explicit orders. So we waited. On the bridge of a warship, in the heart of a hurricane, the waiting is the hardest part. The ship groaned under the assault of another mountainous wave, and I could hear, in my mind's ear, the frantic voice of the man on the radio. "My family is on board. The reply from Pearl Harbor came less than 10 minutes later, but it felt like a lifetime. The encrypted message decrypted line by line onto my screen. It was from Admiral Holloway, the commander of the Pacific Fleet himself. I read it once, then twice, feeling the blood drain from my face. The order was unequivocal. USS Monterey is to disregard civilian distress signal. Vessel is in a non-navigable zone and has violated multiple storm advisories. Your current mission is of critical national importance. Risk to naval personnel and assets is not authorized. Maintain your patrol grid. Acknowledge. It was a death warrant delivered by satellite. The cold, brutal arithmetic of command. One destroyer and its crew of 300 engaged in a sensitive Cold War mission versus one foolish family in a small boat. In the eyes of the Admiral, it wasn't a choice, it was a simple calculation. Captain Thorne moved to my side. "What are our orders, Lieutenant?" he asked. I looked at the words on the screen. "Maintain your patrol grid." Then I looked at the red dot on the map, the last known position of the Sea Serpent. And in that moment, I saw a different map. Not one of grids and patrol zones, but one of right and wrong. My entire being, every fiber of my training, screamed at me to read the order as it was written. To protect my career, to obey the chain of command, to follow the rules that had given my life structure and meaning. But I couldn't. I couldn't be the one to speak those words, to tell my captain to do nothing while a family died in the dark. So, in the split second between duty and conscience, I chose. I took a breath that felt like it was tearing my lungs. "Sir," I said, turning to face him, forcing my voice to remain steady. "The message from Packfoot is heavily corrupted, sir. The storm's playing havoc with the signal. I'm getting fragments. It's almost unreadable." Captain Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Fragments, Lieutenant? What fragments?" This was it. The precipice. The lie felt huge and clumsy in my mouth, but I pushed it out. "I can make out the words, 'Render assistance, sir,'" I said, looking him straight in the eye. "And then, at your discretion. The rest is just noise. It seems they're leaving the final call to you, given our proximity." A silence descended on the bridge, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the roar of the storm. Every officer on watch had heard me. They knew, as well as I did, that a message from Packfoot would never be that ambiguous. They knew I was lying. And Captain Thorne, he knew it most of all. We stood there, locked in a silent duel. He was a cautious man, an ambitious man. But he was also a good man. I had just handed him a way out. I had given him the thinnest veneer of plausible deniability. He could choose to believe my lie and save those people. Or he could call my bluff and save his career. His face was a mask of conflict. He stared at the navigational plot, at our neat little box, and at the desperate red dot so far outside of it. He looked at me, his gaze searching my face, and for a moment I thought he was going to place me under arrest. Then he turned to the helmsman. "Bring the ship about," he said, his voice a low command that cut through the tension like a knife. "New course, 290. Take us to that red dot. And do it fast." A collective, unspoken sigh of relief rippled through the bridge. The helmsman, a seasoned master chief, simply said, "Aye, Captain." Course 290. The massive destroyer began its lumbering turn, a painful, groaning maneuver against the force of the waves. We were no longer a passive observer. We were now active participants. We had joined the storm. My lie hung in the air, a living, breathing thing. I had just risked my entire future on a few fabricated words. But as the ship's bow pointed toward the graveyard of the Pacific, I felt not fear, but a strange, terrifying sense of rightness. We were going to save them. The next hour was a brutal education in the power of the sea. The USS Monterey, a vessel that felt like a floating city in calm waters, was tossed about like a piece of driftwood. Waves the size of office buildings crashed over our bow, sending shudders through the entire length of the hull. On the bridge, we were fighting to stay upright, clinging to rails and consoles as the world tilted and plunged around us. The searchlights sliced through the torrential rain, their beams illuminating a terrifying, liquid landscape of chaos. There was nothing but black water and white foam. Hope began to feel like a fool's errand. "I've got them." The shout came from the lookout on the bridge wing, his voice nearly snatched away by the wind. "Starboard bow. I see a light." I rushed to the window, wiping away the condensation. There, for a fleeting second, I saw it. A tiny, flickering light, like a dying ember in a black fireplace. It was a flashlight, someone waving it frantically. "Helm, all stop," Captain Thorne commanded. "Get the rescue teams on deck. Let's bring them home." Maneuvering the destroyer alongside their crippled vessel was a nightmare. The Sea Serpent was being torn apart by the waves, its mast long gone, its hull low in the water. We risked crushing them with our own bulk. Captain Thorne was magnificent. He handled the ship with a surgeon's precision, using the engines and thrusters to hold us steady against the sea's fury, creating a small, temporary lee for the stricken boat. Our searchlights flooded them with light, and I saw them for the first time. 3 figures. A man holding a small child and a woman clinging to what was left of the cabin. We couldn't launch a boat. It would have been swamped instantly. Instead, our crew fired a line-throwing rocket. It landed perfectly across their deck. A cheer went up on the bridge. The man, who I could now see was gaunt and soaked, but possessed of a strange, calm intensity, secured the line. One by one, we hauled them across the churning gap between the 2 vessels. The woman came first, her face a mask of shock and gratitude. Then they placed the child, a little boy who couldn't have been more than 7, into a rescue sling. As he was lifted into the air, a wave crashed over the Sea Serpent, and the boat began to break apart, sinking into the abyss. The man, the father, leaped for the rope ladder we had lowered, and our crew hauled him aboard just as his boat disappeared beneath the waves. They were on our deck. Safe. The father, who introduced himself only as David, stood there shivering, wrapped in a blanket, his arm around his wife, Helen, and their son, Sam. He looked up at the bridge, and his eyes found mine through the rain-streaked glass. He didn't smile. He just nodded. A single, profound nod of acknowledgement. And in that moment, the weight of what I had done, the lie I had told, seemed to evaporate. I had made the right choice. The cost, I knew, was yet to be paid, but looking at that family, huddled together on the deck of my ship, I was willing to pay it. The return to Naval Station Everett was somber. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean-washed sky, but a different kind of storm was brewing for me. The crew, who had been so jubilant after the rescue, were now quiet and watchful. They knew an inquiry was inevitable. I was a hero to them, but a criminal to the chain of command. The moment we docked, the summons came. "Lieutenant Jenkins, you're wanted in the captain's import cabin." When I walked in, it wasn't just Captain Thorne. Seated behind the table was Admiral Holloway himself. He had flown up from Pearl Harbor. His face was a thundercloud. Standing beside him, almost blending into the wood-paneled walls, was a quiet man in a nondescript gray suit. I had never seen him before. Captain Thorne wouldn't meet my eye. He just gestured for me to stand before the Admiral. "Lieutenant," Admiral Holloway began, his voice low and cold. "I have here the official communications log from Packfleet headquarters for the night of the storm. And I have your ship's log as submitted by Captain Thorne." He pushed the 2 documents across the table. "They do not match. My log shows a clear, direct order to disregard the distress signal. Your log and the captain's subsequent actions were based on your report of a corrupted message and your discretionary interpretation. Explain yourself." There was no point in lying anymore. The game was over. "There is no explanation, Admiral," I said, my voice steady. "I received your order clearly. I chose to disobey it." The Admiral's jaw tightened. "You chose to disobey it," he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief and fury. "You took it upon yourself, a junior lieutenant, to countermand an order from the commander of the Pacific Fleet. You endangered a billion-dollar naval asset and the 300 souls aboard it. For what? For a family that foolishly sailed into a hurricane. I did it for the child, sir," I said simply. "I couldn't give the order that condemned a child to die." "The Navy is not a charity, Lieutenant," he thundered, slamming his hand on the table. "It is an instrument of national defense. Your sentimentality could have cost us everything. There are things in motion on this coast that you cannot possibly comprehend. Your actions will be dealt with in the harshest possible terms. I will see you court-martialed and dash. Admiral. The voice was quiet, but it cut through Holloway's rage like a razor. It was the man in the gray suit. He stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on the Admiral's shoulder. Perhaps that will not be necessary. He turned his calm, analytical eyes on me. Lieutenant Jenkins, he said, his tone neutral, the man you rescued, the man who called himself David. Did he say anything else to you? About who he was or where he was going? No, sir, I replied, confused. He was very quiet. He just thanked us for saving his family. The man in the suit nodded slowly. He looked at Admiral Holloway, and a silent, high-level conversation seemed to pass between them. The Admiral's face went from rage to confusion, and then to a kind of dawning, horrified understanding. He sank back into his chair, looking suddenly older and smaller. The man in the suit turned back to me. Lieutenant, your actions, while a flagrant breach of every rule in the book, have inadvertently resolved a situation of the gravest national importance. The man you know as David is, in fact, Dr. Alastair Finch. He is one of this country's foremost theoretical physicists and a lead negotiator on the START treaty talks. He was under immense pressure, a pressure none of us can truly imagine. 2 weeks ago, he suffered a severe psychological breakdown and simply vanished. He took his family and he ran, seeking to disappear. We thought he had been abducted. We feared he might defect. His disappearance was a 5-alarm national security crisis. The critical mission you were on? It was part of the covert search for him. The room spun. I leaned on the back of a chair to steady myself. The family I had saved, the quiet father, he was a piece in the great Cold War chess game. My simple, emotional act of defiance had stumbled headfirst into the world of spies and state secrets. A court-martial is impossible, the man in the suit continued calmly. It would expose everything. Dr. Finch's condition, the vulnerability of our treaty position. It would be a disaster. You, Lieutenant, have become a complication that must be managed. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something human in his eyes. You also, as it happens, became his salvation. You did a good thing, for all the wrong reasons. The Navy cannot be seen to reward such insubordination. Therefore, your career is over. You will be granted an honorable discharge for medical reasons. You will sign a document binding you to absolute silence forever. You will never speak of this to anyone. My naval life was over, but I wasn't being erased in anger. I was being hidden, filed away as a state secret. Captain Thorne received a quiet, lateral transfer to a desk job in San Diego. His promising career effectively stalled. Dr. Finch and his family were spirited away, given new identities, a new life, a true disappearance granted by the very government he had fled. On my last day on base, as I was packing my car to leave the life I loved behind forever, a young ensign delivered a small, heavy package to me. There was no note from the sender, just my name on the label. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the compass from the Sea Serpent. And tucked beneath it was a small, folded piece of paper. On it were 3 words, written in a steady, elegant hand. For finding us. And below that, a postscript. True north is not always on the map. I have kept that compass on my mantelpiece for 40 years. It's a relic from a life I can't talk about, a symbol of a secret I will carry to my grave. I never achieved the rank I wanted. I never commanded a ship of my own. But on one dark, violent night, when faced with a choice between my orders and my humanity, I chose humanity. I didn't know who the father was. I didn't know I was intervening in the high-stakes drama of nations. I just heard the echo of a family in fear, and I chose to turn the ship. The compass needle may be broken, but mine, I know, found its true north that night. And it has never wavered since. The weight of a secret is a strange and heavy thing. It's not a burden you can set down. For 40 years, my story has been like a phantom limb, an ache for a part of me that was amputated in a quiet, wood-paneled room. I could feel its shape, its memory, the ghost of a crisp uniform on my shoulders and the solid thrum of a destroyer's deck beneath my feet. But it wasn't there. The world saw Sarah Jenkins, the quiet woman who ran the local historical society, the one who knew so much about the shipwrecks in the strait. No one knew that I carried the knowledge of the greatest shipwreck of all, the one that never happened, the one that cost me everything and, in the end, gave me a compass that pointed to a truth more profound than any magnetic north. The years immediately following my discharge were the hardest. I was unmoored. The Navy had been my anchor, my structure, my family. Suddenly, I was adrift in the civilian world, a world that felt chaotic and purposeless. I moved to the Pacific Northwest, drawn by the same moody waters that had defined my final hours in uniform. I took jobs. I was a bookkeeper for a lumber company, a paralegal in a small law firm, a records manager for the county. I was competent, I was reliable, but I was always on the outside looking in. My colleagues would talk about their college days, their first loves, their defining moments. I would just smile and listen. My defining moment was classified. It was a state secret locked inside me, and the silence it demanded was a kind of profound, unending loneliness. I never spoke of Dr. Alistair Finch or David as I knew him. I never mentioned the sea serpent or the lie I told on the bridge of the Monterey. Sometimes, on stormy nights when the wind howled and rattled the windows of my little house, I would stand and watch the churning water, and I would be back there. I would feel the pitch of the deck, hear the scream of the wind, see the desperate, flickering flashlight in the dark. I would wonder about them. Did Dr. Finch ever find peace? Did Helen ever stop having nightmares about the waves? And Sam, what becomes of a little boy who looks into the face of the abyss and is pulled back by a rope? I prayed they had found a quiet harbor, a life of unremarkable joy. Their happiness was the only justification for the sacrifice I'd made, the only balm for the phantom ache of my lost career. I followed Captain Thorne's career from a distance, through publicly available naval registries. Just as the man in the gray suit had predicted, his ascent stopped. He received no more commands at sea. He was shuffled from one dreary administrative post to another until his retirement. I felt a pang of guilt for that. My lie had saved his conscience, but had torpedoed his ambition. As for Admiral Holloway, he retired a few years later with full honors. His official biography lauded him as a master strategist of the Cold War, a man of iron will and unwavering principle. There was no mention of the graveyard of the Pacific, no footnote about the order that would have cost him a crucial national asset, not in a missile or a ship, but in a man. Life settled into a new rhythm. I found a quiet purpose in curating the stories of others, the histories of the fishermen and sailors who had plied these waters for generations. I became a keeper of memories, while my own most vital memory remained under lock and key. The compass from the sea serpent sat on my mantelpiece, a silent confidant. It was a tangible piece of the truth. Over the decades, the bitterness faded, replaced by a quiet, philosophical acceptance. I had traded a life of command for a life of contemplation. I had lost a career, but I had held on to a piece of my soul. It seemed a fair, if painful, exchange. Then, last spring, everything changed. A registered letter arrived. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, and the return address was a law firm in Boston. I opened it with a sense of unease. I assumed it was some long-forgotten inheritance or a legal notice. Inside was a smaller envelope, and the handwriting on the front was unfamiliar. It simply said, "For Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins." No one had called me that in 40 years. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I slit open the envelope. The letter inside was long, several pages written in a clear, strong hand. I sat down in my armchair, the one that looks out over the water, and I began to read. "Dear Lieutenant Jenkins," it began. "You do not know me, but my name is Dr. Samuel Finch. 40 years ago, I was a 7-year-old boy named Sam, adrift in a hurricane with my parents on a boat called the Sea Serpent. You were the communications officer on the USS Monterey. You saved my life." I had to stop and take a breath. My hands were trembling, blurring the words. Sam. Little Sam. He was a doctor now. I continued reading. "My father, Alistair Finch, passed away peacefully last month at the age of 82. He lived a long, quiet, and profoundly good life after the events of that night. He left instructions in his will for me to find you and to finally tell you the rest of the story. He needed you to know that your sacrifice was not in vain. He needed you to know the ripples it sent through the world. After you rescued us, we were given a new life. My father became a high school physics teacher in a small town in Vermont. He never worked on a government project again. He found more joy, he told me, in explaining the universe to teenagers than he ever did in advising presidents. My mother, Helen, became a painter. For years, she painted seascapes, not of storms, but of calm harbors at dawn. It was her way of healing. And I grew up in a house filled with love and quiet gratitude. I became a pediatrician. I spend my days trying to heal children, a debt I feel I owe to the universe and to you. But my father needed you to know more. He was a quiet man, but he was not naive. He knew the crisis his disappearance had caused, and he knew the impossible position you had been put in. For years, he followed the careers of the men on that bridge. He kept a file. He told me that Captain Thorne, the man who gave the order to save us, left the Navy a few years after his transfer. He became the head of a maritime search and rescue charity, a nonprofit that operates in the most dangerous waters on Earth, rescuing civilians the way he rescued us. My father secretly became one of his largest anonymous donors. He said that Captain Thorne had lost his career, but found his calling. And then there is the story of Admiral Holloway. This, my father said, was the part you needed to hear most. About 10 years after the incident, a similar situation occurred. A small fishing vessel was caught in a typhoon in the South China Sea, outside the designated patrol area of a U.S. carrier group. The commander on the scene, citing protocol, was about to leave them to their fate. But an order came down from Packfoot, directly from Admiral Holloway himself. The order was just 2 words: render assistance. It became a famous case study in naval ethics, a shift in policy known informally as the Holloway Doctrine, which gave commanders more latitude in humanitarian situations. The admiral, the man of iron rules, had changed the rules. My father always believed that night in 1983 changed him, too. He never spoke of it, but his actions did. He learned, as you did, that some things are more important than the rulebook. My father never forgot you. He kept your name, your rank, and the name of your ship in his heart. He called you his impossible variable, the human element that the cold calculus of command had failed to account for. He said you didn't just save 3 people. You saved a man from his own despair, you gave a captain a new purpose, and you taught an admiral a lesson in humanity that may have saved countless others. He asked me to send you the enclosed. It was his most prized possession after his family. He wanted you to have it. My eyes were so blurred with tears I could barely see. Tucked into the back of the letter was a small, plastic-sleeved photograph. It was of a happy, older couple, their faces lined with laughter, standing with a younger man who had his arms around them. In front of them stood a woman and 2 small children. It was Alistair and Helen, looking old and content. It was Sam, a man now, with his own family. It was the future I had saved. The generations that existed because of a lie told in a storm. I stood up and walked to the mantelpiece. I picked up the old, broken compass. For so long, it had been a symbol of my lost direction, a reminder of the career I had been forced to abandon. But now, holding it in my hand, I understood. The letter from Sam had recalibrated everything. The compass wasn't broken. It had simply been pointing to a different kind of north all along. Not the north of rank and protocol and ambition, but the true north of the human heart. My life has not been the one I planned. I have no medals on my wall, no formal accolades. My name will not be remembered in the annals of naval history. But I have the letter from a man I saved as a boy. I have the knowledge that my single, insubordinate act of compassion echoed through lives I never met, changing them for the better. I set a captain on a new course, helped an admiral find a new doctrine, and gave a family 40 years of quiet, beautiful life. I look out at the water now, and the ghost limb no longer aches. The secret is no longer a burden. It is a legacy. It is the story of a night when a young woman in a windowless room decided that the calculus of the heart was more important than the calculus of command. My name is Sarah Jenkins, and that is a story worth a lifetime.